Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us on our delayed Azure native workshop. First of all, I'd just like to apologize for the technical issues yesterday. They were unfortunately outside of our control, and we really do apologize. If you are watching this back on YouTube and you were originally intended to join us on Tuesday, this is now running on Wednesday. So hopefully you didn't have too much problems joining us today. I have my wonderful helper, Zach, with me today. He will be in the chat answering any questions that you may have as we kind of go along. We've run a couple of these workshops now, and what I've tried to do is change the format a little bit to make it a little bit less formal and make it a little bit more ad hoc and interactive so that you can actually see kind of the experience of what it looks like to use Pulumi. We are going to be using Azure today. Hopefully everybody got the email that asked you to kind of make sure you set up your environment. If you would like to follow along, I will very quickly guide you through the things that you need to do to follow along. If not, then feel free to just kind of observe and watch and ask questions. That's totally valid too. I'm going to wait one more minute just to make sure there's no late arrivals, and then we're going to get started. I have very few slides for this workshop today. I'm going to dive right into a coding exercise, and I'm also going to try a couple of things that we haven't tried before. So if we do see any technical issues, then we will work through them and we'll just kind of see how it goes. I'm really trying to give everybody here the feeling of what it's like to work with Pulumi. We're trying to make these a little bit less formal, and we may run into some technical issues. So we'll just kind of see how it goes as we work through today. While I'm waiting for any late arrivals, it would be great to see where you are in the world and where you're joining us from. So I can see people in the Big Marker chat are already kind of letting us know where they are. I'm sorry it's raining in Toronto. It's a beautiful sunny day here in Seattle. Hopefully the weather clears. I'll just wait one more minute and then we'll get started. Okay, so I'm just going to flip the slides on here. What we're going to do now is we're going to get started. I'm going to take you through the usual setup steps to kind of get registered with Pulumi. You should see in the handout that there is 2 links for you. One of which is how to install the Azure CLI, which will help you get set up and logged in. If you haven't already done that and you're not logged into an Azure account, please take the time to do that now. In a moment, I'm going to guide you through setting up your Pulumi account and getting started with logging in with Pulumi. But while I kind of get ready to do that, I'm just going to send a poll out to everybody that gets an idea of if this is your first time using Pulumi and if you've used Pulumi before. It may show up in the background, so it may be a different window that the poll shows up in. If you could just take a time to hit yes or no and let us know if this is your first time kind of using Pulumi, it would be very much appreciated. I am just at the moment getting my environment set up and ready to use. So please just bear with me a second. Usually I do this ahead of time, but due to us rescheduling things today, there were a couple of things that I had to catch up on. So please bear with me while I get this all taken care of. Okay. I am now going to share my screen. Hopefully everybody will be able to see it. Hopefully the text is big enough. If you do have any problems seeing anything at any point today, then please just let us know in the chat and Zach will interrupt me and let me know that we need to bump up the text size. So before we get into the Azure part of the workshop, it is important that everybody has set up their Pulumi account so that we have somewhere to store our Pulumi state. And I'll talk a little bit more about this as we kind of go through the exercises, but I just want to make sure everybody is at this stage. So I'm going to very quickly guide you through spinning up a new Pulumi account. So you can see I'm signed in here in my GitHub account as my test account, lbriggs-pulumi. And what I'm going to do is I'm I'm going to head to the pulumi.com website, like so. I'm going to paste this in the chat so everybody can click on it if they need to. And in the top right-hand corner, there is a sign-in button. And if you already have a Pulumi account, then it's good to make sure that you are signed in. So click on this sign in button. And I need to sign out so that I can actually show you what happens. Click the sign in button and it should show you 4 options like so. I'm going to use my GitHub account to sign in if you use GitLab primarily or Atlassian, or you can even sign up with email if you so wish. Then, you can use those as well as your identity provider. Just to make it nice and straightforward for me, I'm going to use my already signed in GitHub account. So I'm going to click on this GitHub link here. And you should see a page like this, which is asking for authorization to your GitHub account. The reason that we need this information is so that we can actually grab your email address from GitHub and also look at the GitHub repos that you have in order to associate them with Pulumi projects. So just take a second to review the permissions here, whether it's read-only access, which it should be for both of these two things. And then finally, just hit authorize Pulumi like so. And what should happen is that you should see something like this. This is the getting started page within the Pulumi console. This is where we store our state. So we're going to provision resources in Azure today, and we're going to write code that provisions resources with the Azure native provider. And what Pulumi does is it creates those resources using the Azure native provider that I mentioned, and then it stores the result of those operations inside this state storage. We do have options for teams with these organization features, but everybody does get a free individual account that will be free forever. And so I would highly recommend using this as your state storage today. I'm going to pause there, make sure everybody has a Pulumi account set up. If anybody is having any problems, please let us know in the chat, and we should be able to kind of assist you and get you kind of working there if you are planning on following along. Okay. So we want to provision resources in Azure with infrastructure as software. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the value proposition for Pulumi before we kind of get diving in here. We're going to be using the TypeScript SDK today. And hopefully as you follow along with this presentation, you should be able to see some of the value that using these familiar languages, using these strongly typed languages brings to your infrastructure as code workflows. I'm going to show you some real world examples of what happens when you kind of make mistakes and how the type system can help you. But there are other languages available that can also interact with Azure. So I have a poll set up here, and the final poll before the end of the webinar. I'd like to just get an idea of the people who are attending today, which of the language SDKs you foresee using in the future. We are going to be using TypeScript for the Azure workshop today, but we do support provisioning resources in Azure with all of our supported languages. So that's Node.js, Python, Go, and the .NET ecosystems are all supported. So if you could just take a second to just let us know in the poll which of these languages that you envision using, that will be extremely helpful for us. We like to get an idea of people who are attending this workshop, which of these languages they are likely to use. It looks like we have quite a few TypeScript people here today, and there's obviously a couple of Python people and then a .NET person. So it is worth remembering when you when you kind of watching the content today that while we'll be using TypeScript, it is important to kind of know that all of the concepts that we're going to be talking about, while TypeScript specific, do apply to all of the different language ecosystems. So we're going to be creating resources and assigning the result of those resources to a variable. But of course, if you're using Python, the same mechanism will apply. You'll just be using a different syntax for the Python language instead. Okay, so I have created an account with the Pulumi console. So what I now need to do is I now need to log into that account. What that does is it associates my local command line interface, which I have installed here. And I obviously can't spell today. It associates my Pulumi command line interface, which we did send an email out asking you to install. It associates my local Pulumi command line interface with a Pulumi account. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the Pulumi login command, like so. And if you followed along with workshops before, and you've used the Gitpod environment, which I'm not using today, if you've used the Gitpod environment, this is automatically prompted for you when you open things in a Gitpod environment. If you've attended our introductory workshop, you may not have taken this step because we automatically prompt you to log in. So I'm going to run the Pulumi login command, and it will see that you'll see that there is a prompt here where it's asking me to provision a token, where I can either click this link or I could just hit enter, which will open a browser. I'm going to copy a token for this particular exercise because I have 2 Pulumi accounts and I want to make sure I'm using the right one. But you can just hit the enter button and it will automatically take you through the sign-in flow. So I'm going to provision a new token here, like so. I'm going to give it a name local. I'm going to copy this token and paste it in here. Again, if you just hit the enter button, it will actually open a browser for you to actually provision all of this stuff for you. So there's a much easier flow if you are using this locally. Final thing that I need to do in order to get set up is to make sure that I'm logged in correctly into my Azure account. If you are familiar with Azure, you should have the AZ CLI installed, which I currently do. There is a link in the handouts on how to install the AZ CLI. If you have not kind of done that and you do want to follow along. But what you want to do is run the AZ login command like so. And you can see that I'm already signed in with my Pulumi account. And so what happened here is very similar to the Pulumi login workflow. It's opened a browser for me to actually log in. And if I just hit this, which you may get prompted for a password, it should allow me to log in. And I am now, I've got this response from the Azure interface that tells me that I'm logged in as lbriggs@pulumi.com, and so that I now have access to provision things in Azure. It's also possible for you to verify this by running the command AZ account list, which should get you the same response. Hopefully everybody is at a stage where they can kind of log into Azure. If anybody is having any problems, then please let us know in the chat. We can kind of assist you there. Okay, hopefully everybody is at a stage now where they're ready to actually provision some infrastructure. So what I've done prior to this workshop is I've set up our usual GitHub repos that have the content in them, which you can see I've got open here. And then there's also this www root directory. And I'm going to talk through a little bit about what we've got going on in here. So this link is in the handouts. I'm also going to paste it into the chat to make sure that everybody is able to access it. You should be able to follow along with this. If you are following along by kind of typing this out as I go along, then you should be able to see that in the content directory, we have these 3 labs. So these 3 labs are separated into 3 stages. The first is very simple. We're just going to create a Pulumi project. The second, we're going to create a static website with the HTML files that we've provisioned. And then the third step is that we're going to provision that same static website, but instead we're going to use a Docker container, and we're going to use the Azure Web App Services to actually deploy it. So let's take a look at what the actual the application that I've put together that we're all going to deploy together looks like. So if you take a look in this www root folder, all that is in here is a very simple static page with a little bit of CSS and JavaScript. And you can also see that there is a 404 document that we'll need at some point. And then finally, we have a Docker file, which is just a simple web server that copies those static HTML files into the Docker file. This is designed to be just a relatively straightforward application that we're going to deploy today. Obviously, you have way more elaborate applications that you are probably deploying on your day-to-day work life. And all of the concepts that we're going to learn today still apply. So the reason that we're going to do a static website is because it gives you a nice, easy mechanism to see how the Pulumi type system works. And then we're going to use a more real-world example of deploying a Docker image to an Azure web app service. So let's get started. If you have followed along with a Pulumi workshop before, some of this first step will feel pretty familiar. What I'm actually going to do before I kind of continue, if you are a VS Code user, I am going to share my IDE in a read-only mechanism so that everybody can see as we go along. I've never tried this before. So I want to see if it works. If it doesn't, then you can just continue looking at my screen. But I thought this might be an interesting way for everybody to be able to kind of see what's actually going on while we are, while we're kind of doing this. So I'm going to grab this invite participants link and let's paste this in the chat. And what should happen, if you are a VS Code user, you should be able to click that link and you should be joined into my environment and be able to see as I'm working what's going on in a read-only manner. And so if you do want to jump in, then you can just you can click that link. If not, then please just kind of continue as we are kind of creating code as we go along. If anybody does want to join and they do click that link and there is any problems, then just let me know in the chat and we'll take a quick pause there. I thought this might be an interesting way of kind of feeling like we're all collaborating. And there's a couple people that are trying to join, so I'm just going to accept these. Give a couple more minutes for everybody to kind of see if they want to join in as well. Looks like it's going to take a couple seconds. You'll have to kind of authenticate through the process. So let's see how many people want to join here. There is a limit of 30, and there's only 16 people here today. So if everybody does want to kind of watch along as I'm writing this code out, then please feel free to just kind of jump in. Okay. So let's get started. Let's create our first Pulumi project. Hopefully everybody can see my screen successfully. If there's any issues with the size, then please let me know. So the first thing that you want to do when you're creating a Pulumi program is you want to create an empty directory to actually store all of your Pulumi code in. This is not an empty directory. It's a checked out Git repo with the content and the application in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the make dir command. People, my first Azure app, like so. So you would just give your Pulumi project a name that you felt fit. The name of the project will correspond to the directory. So I'm going to go into the directory and I'm going to run the Pulumi new command, like so. And you can see there is a lot of different options here. I get prompted for a lot of different options, and I can even see some additional templates. So if you are a .NET user and you want to write your code in Visual Basic, we do have a Visual Basic template, which I love. I think it's great. But what I'm going to do in order to actually make things a little bit easier is I'm going to provide a template to the Pulumi new command. So I'm going to do Pulumi new TypeScript, which will prompt me for some values that I need to provide to Pulumi to create a new project. The first thing is that it's going to ask me for my my project name, and it will default to the name of the directory that I'm currently in. And I'm okay with this, using this as a project name, so I'm going to hit enter. The second thing that it will prompt me for is a description. The description is really useful if you are collaborating with your colleagues. It will give you information about what this stack is doing. Because this is kind of a demo environment, I'm just going to hit enter and use the default description, which is a minimal TypeScript Pulumi program. And then finally, it's going to prompt me for a stack name. We aren't really going to talk a lot about stacks today. If you are interested in what stacks are and you're not familiar with them, then what I would recommend is just kind of following along. We have an introduction to Pulumi workshop coming up. And we also have lots of information about what stacks can and can't do and how useful and flexible they are on our website. And if you also have questions about stacks as well, then please let us know in the chat. And hopefully Zach will be able to kind of assist you there. I'm going to use the default stack name of dev today for most of the provisioning that we're going to be doing. So I'm just going to hit enter and it will create my Pulumi project. If you are familiar with NPM, what you're seeing here will look very familiar. So that it's installing NPM dependencies into my environment. And it's kind of doing an NPM install, which will install all of the different things that I need in order to actually kind of provision a Pulumi environment. And of course, because this is a live demo, it looks like that I'm running into issues. And so I'm not really sure what's going on here. Usually this happens in like 3 seconds. So there must have been a disk issue there or something. I don't know. So it's installing a bunch of dependencies for me into my environment using NPM. And you can take a look at these dependencies by having a look in the package.json here. Again, this will depend on the language that you're going to use. So if you are a .NET user, you'll have a CS proj here. If you are a Python user, you'll have a requirements.txt. It depends on the language that you're going to be using. And so what this has done is it's installed the Pulumi dependencies here, and it's also installed the node types, which we're going to be using because we're going to be using TypeScript today. So this has actually bootstrapped a node project for us to actually get up and running, which is really useful because it means we don't have to copy a bunch of files around and we don't have to kind of jump through a bunch of hoops to kind of bootstrap our node project. Inside our Pulumi project, you'll see that it's given us a boilerplate file which has imported the Pulumi dependency. What this is basically telling us is that we're going to be using the Pulumi SDK, which is the kind of default SDK that we use for things like configuration and other kind of stuff. But we are also going to need an additional dependency, an additional import in our Azure workshop. So we are obviously going to be provisioning things in Azure. So we need to add another dependency for the Azure provider, which will bring us the TypeScript SDK for Azure and also a plugin which gets installed, which allows us to actually run programs and talk to the Azure API. The way that we do this is we use our package manager again. So I'm going to run npm install at Pulumi /Azure-native. We do have an Azure provider, which is we're kind of calling our legacy provider at this point. The Azure native provider is a brand new mechanism of provisioning resources in Azure. And we generate this Azure SDK directly from the Azure Open API spec. So what that means is that as soon as an Azure service is kind of released, or as soon as they add a new feature to a particular Azure resource, we get support for it the same day. And this is really powerful. If you've ever used some of the competitive, if you've ever used any of the competitor infrastructure as code tools, you will probably be familiar with like new features becoming available and it taking almost weeks or sometimes even months or sometimes even years to add support for these different Azure features. Pulumi now gets these features on the same day and often within hours of adding them to the Azure service. And so because we're generating the Azure resource specifications directly from Azure, it's possible to actually, get really powerful results and try out and use these new features really, really quickly. So if you are installing Azure and you are using Azure already with your infrastructure as code with Pulumi, it is always useful to kind of migrate from the Azure provider to the Azure native provider. So let's install that. I'm going to run enter. I'm going to hit enter, sorry. And it looks like it's taking a little while. These usually happens within seconds. So I'm wondering if npm is having a couple problems today, but it's not really clear at the moment. So this is installing the Azure plugin, which is the actual mechanism within Pulumi that talks to the Azure API, and it's also installing all the Azure SDK as well, the Azure native SDK, which we'll use to actually provision resources. The final thing that we need to do is we need to set a configuration value. If you are following along at home, you need to make sure you do this step as well. So what I'm going to do is run Pulumi config set Azure-native, which is obviously the name of the provider, and then location. And this is a required configuration option for all of the Azure provider. So you'll need to actually tell Azure which of the available Azure locations you want to use. I am based in Seattle, Washington, so I'm going to use West US just because it's closer to me. And what this will do is you'll see here that it's in this, when we created our project earlier, we created a stack, a dev stack. And what this has done is it's set that location inside our dev stack. This is really useful if you are provisioning infrastructure, the same infrastructure across different locations. You could perhaps have a different Azure, a different Pulumi stack for each Azure location. And then you can provision the exact same infrastructure across all of those different locations. It's a really powerful mechanism that allows you to really kind of be flexible in what you need to do. So we've created our first Azure app, and it's pretty bare bones at the moment. It's just an index.ts with no actual resources in it. But we have got all set up and we're all ready to go. So let's take the next step and let's actually import our dependencies into this environment. So what we want to do first, if you are familiar with Azure, you'll know about resource groups. What we need to do is provision a resource group to store all of the resources that we're going to create. And so we need to import that resource into our environment. So the way we do that is in TypeScript is like so. We do import all as resources from @Pulumi Azure-native /resources. If you are familiar with Pulumi, you'll probably notice that this is a little bit different to some of the other providers. Because the surface area of the Azure provider is so large, we've actually namespaced all of the different resource subtypes into different packages, which means that you don't have to kind of import huge amounts of stuff into your Pulumi program. And so I'm going to import all of these different things by their namespace. And this is available in all of the different languages as well. And so if you are using pip, then you would do from something. If you are using pip, then you're probably familiar with the Python syntax. So now that we've imported this Azure native provider, what we now need to do is create our resource group. And if you remember what I said earlier, the way that we do that in all of the different languages is that we create a variable and then we assign the result of the actual resource creation to that variable. So what this looks like in TypeScript is we're going to do const resource group equals new resources dot. There we go. I was like, oh, my autocomplete's not working. So we're going to do resources dot resource group, like so. And we're going to create a resource group with the name of app, just for the sake of it. So this is just going to create a resource group with a name of app, and it's going to allow us to be able to store all of the sub-resources that we're going to create inside that resource group. Now, a resource group on its own isn't very useful. And so what we want to do, if you remember earlier, the first thing that we're going to create is a static website, which is a very simple resource, but it will give you an idea of what what the Azure native provider looks like for a very simple example. So we need to, if we're going to provision a static website, we can use Azure's storage mechanisms to actually do that. There is actually an API to create a static website within Azure. So we need to add another import. So we're going to import all as storage from @Pulumi Azure native storage, like so. And hopefully this is going to update any minute now. Once my IDE is kind of caught up. So we're going to import this storage mechanism here, which we're then going to, very similar to what we did with our resource group, we are going to create a storage account that we will use. This storage account allows us to specify some values on the actual storage that we might find useful. So for example, the kind and a SKU. And I'm going to show you a really useful thing that is available within the actual Azure native provider in just a second. But first, let's create a variable, storage account equals new storage dot storage account. And we've got to give every Pulumi resource a name. So I'm going to call this app, like so. And then I'm going to specify some required parameters for this particular app. And you can see that my IDE is telling me that there are missing properties that are required in this particular storage account resource. So it's telling me that the resource group name and the SKU are both required in order to actually create a storage account. Now, if you've used ARM templates as an example, what you might have seen as a thing that happens is if you miss off these required resources, or if you miss off, or if you spell things incorrectly in your ARM templates, what can end up happening is that you try and provision your infrastructure and you don't actually get told that you're missing something until you've tried to provision that piece of infrastructure. And the feedback loop can often be really, really slow. So by using these strongly typed languages, we are getting the feedback immediately. We're being told that we need to specify we're being told we need to specify a resource group name and a SKU for a storage account before we've even tried to provision that infrastructure, which, in terms of iteration, in terms of being able to create infrastructure quickly, this to me is one of the most powerful things that we can get from our infrastructure as code. This quick feedback loop of being able to know that the infrastructure that we're going to create is going to be right and have all of the required parameters before we even try and provision it. So let's fill in all of the things that we need here. So the first thing I want to do is make sure this is HTTPS only, because we are good internet citizens and we want to make sure that we're only using HTTPS traffic. I'm then going to specify a kind of storage account. And I'm going to show you a really useful mechanism within the Azure native provider that we get by generating all of these resources from the upstream API. So I'm going to do storage. I'm going to spell it right, and then I'm going to I'm going to look at all the properties of storage, which again is coming from our import. And I know that I'm going to need to specify a kind, like so. So I'm going to specify kind, and then I'm going to look at the kind properties. And what is really powerful here, because we're generating these mechanisms from upstream API, we get this thing called enums, which are pre-populated values for this property. And so I can make, what I could do is I could say something, if I could just specify this as a string, like so. Which would work if I got the correct string, and I might have to look this up in an alternative location. But because we are able to generate the allowed values from the upstream API, we can remove the number of errors that we're getting in our infrastructure as code workflow by using these properties that are generated from the API, these allowed values. So I'm going to use storage v2, the latest version of the storage, but hopefully you're getting an idea here of what the power of generating these values from the upstream API means. It means that you can actually see all of the allowed properties for a particular input or for a particular property for a resource. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to set the resource group name. Again, this is a required input. So if you remember, if we hover over this again, you'll see that the resource group name is required, and it is telling us that it does require this. So what I could do here is, again, I could use a standard string, right? I could just use the resource group name of app. But again, this presents potential for errors. And it also means that Pulumi does not know what the relationship is between the storage account and the resource group. So what I'd like to do instead is I'd like to use a property from my resource group, like so. And by using this property, this name property from our resource group, what that's doing is it's telling Pulumi that you cannot create the storage account until the name of the resource group has been resolved by Pulumi, and it creates these dependencies between these two different resources. This is what allows us to write our code in an imperative language, but get a declarative result. And so this is super powerful because it means that Pulumi knows the order of operations, and it creates a resource graph in order to kind of do this. The final thing that we actually need to specify, and you'll see that my IDE is now telling me that I am resolving all of the required inputs for a storage. The final thing that we need to do is specify a SKU. And again, I can use the auto-generated values like so. And so, again, I could specify a string here if I really wanted to. But why leave myself the possibility of making mistakes or getting things wrong? I can use these auto-generated values, these enums, to actually make sure that when I create this thing, I'm going to provide the right value. So I'm going to use standard LRS as a SKU here, and you'll see that my IDE is updating me. It's telling me that there is no longer any issues with this particular resource. I've added all of the required properties. I've added all the things that I need, and now I can just continue kind of creating my infrastructure. I'm going to make sure this is saved, and then I'm going to do the final the final resource of this particular step. If you are following along at home, you'll see that we're still on lab 2 here. We're still provisioning a static website. So the next thing that we want to do is we need to define a static website resource. So I can do that with another constant, new storage.static storage account static website. And what I need to do here is specify again a specifier resource name. I'm just going to call it app in this particular example. And then this has some required properties as well. So let's take a look at what they are. We need to specify an account name, and we also need to specify a resource group name. We already created a storage account, so let's populate that. Let's do account name, storage account dot name. And then we also need a resource group name. So let's populate that in a similar manner to what we did before. Name. Like so. And that's enough for us to create a storage account static website, right? Like that's enough for us to actually create this. But there are a couple of optional properties that we can specify as well. We can tell the storage account static website resource where to look for our index document. So let's do that. And I know that I'm going to upload an index.html from here. And then we can also specify a error document. So let's specify this, which is here. So that is our static website has been defined. We have created a static website using a couple of different mechanisms here. We've used the enums to actually make sure that the values that we're inputting to the resources are correct. And we've used output properties to make sure there's dependencies between these resources within Azure. I'm going to pause there, take a quick drink, check in on the chat, see if there's any questions. If anybody does have any questions, let me know. And then the next step that we'll take here is that we actually need to upload these files into our storage bucket so that we can actually see our website. hopefully, I can see there are still 4 people on the live share. If anybody is having any problems with that, I'd love to hear it in the chat. Again, I am trying something new out here. Hopefully, this is valuable, being able to see this as well, kind of in real time. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do, or the final thing that we need to do almost, is we need to upload this index.html and this 404.html into our bucket. And so how do we do that? Well, we use a storage.blob resource, right? Each one of those storage.blob resource, each one of these files, so the 404.html and the index.html, both of these files need to be uploaded. And what you might consider doing is you might consider doing something like this, equals new storage.blob index. And then do a second one like so. That's a totally valid way of doing this, right? You can do a one for each resource. But we are using TypeScript. We're using a programming language here that has the mechanism of being able to do loops and maps and all kinds of interesting stuff. So instead of kind of defining a resource for each of these files, let's instead use a mechanism within TypeScript to loop through those files. So I'm going to define an array. And in that array, I'm going to specify my index.html and my 404.html, like so. And then I'm going to use the JavaScript map function to loop through each one of these files. And I need to close out all of these. There we go. Thank you, IDE, for telling me my syntax is incorrect. So I'm going to loop through. I'm going to use a map to loop through this array and create a new resource as we loop. So let's do name, new, storage account, storage.blob even, name. So if you are familiar with JavaScript, this will look pretty familiar to you. This is just looping through, this is just using the map function to loop through all of the files that are in this particular array. And then we're going to create a new resource for each one of those values. This is really powerful, and it's not a Pulumi feature. This is a TypeScript feature that Pulumi is able to take advantage of while we are creating resources. And so this can really dramatically reduce the amount of code you're using. If you are familiar with ARM templates, this is probably much, much easier if you are familiar with the kind of ARM template declarative way of doing things. Again, my IDE is telling me that we haven't specified some of these options. And so let's make sure that we fill these in. Let's see what we actually need. A resource group name, an account name, and a container name is required for this particular resource. So let's do resource group name is resource group.name. And then account name, let's use account storage account.name. And then finally, container name will be our static website dot container name, like so. So that's enough for us to upload those storage blobs if that's what we actually want to do. But we actually need to tell the storage blob asset where to look for the files to actually upload them. And so we need to specify a source, which is an optional thing, but we need it in this particular case because we know that we want to upload this 404 document and this index.html document. So let's specify a source. And we do this using a Pulumi SDK mechanism called the Pulumi asset. So asset dot file asset, and we are going to do, it's in the www directory, one directory above, and then finally we're going to be using this name here to actually locate this. So what we're doing here for this source is telling this resource, look in this directory for a file name of index.html. As it builds the loop, it's going to loop through these two files and then find those file assets like so. And then finally, let's specify our content type. We know what type of content these things are. So let's do text, HTML, like so. And that is finished. That's rounded out our static website. Super straightforward, hopefully. Hopefully it's relatively easy to kind of follow and understand. We've used a lot of different things here. So I'm going to just recap and go through what we've actually done. We have created a resource group using the resources mechanism. We've created a storage account, and we've used our enums here to actually make sure that those values are correct. And we've also used an output property from our resource group to make sure that the dependencies between these two resources have been resolved within Pulumi. The next thing that we did is we created a storage account website with an account name, again, a property from this particular resource. So if you imagine how this might look in your mind, we've got a resource group, and there's a dependency for the storage account on the resource group, and there's a dependency on the resource group from the static website, and also the storage account. So you can see that this is creating this kind of elaborate dependency graph between these two different things. And then finally, we've uploaded our two pre-created files to the storage account that the storage object that we've created. And we've done that using a TypeScript map function. Instead of actually defining these individually, we've looped through them instead. So this is our static website, right? We've created it, and let's go ahead and actually run our Pulumi up. Hopefully everybody who's on the live share can see my terminal. If you can't, then please let me know. So we should be able to run Pulumi up now, like so. And you'll see that it's creating all of the different resources that we have already talked about. So it's going to create a resource group called app. It's going to create a storage account called app, a storage account static website called app, and then it's going to create two resources, one for each blob. So this is the result of this map function here. It's looped through these two files and created a new blob for each one. And I can take a look and examine the details of what it's going to create here, and kind of look that it's going to, you can see all of the different properties that it's going to create. You can see, look, this is the standard, this is the string that has been resolved by this enum here. And so if we wanted, we could specify that as a string, but why do that when we can be sure that we're not going to actually make these mistakes? So let's provision this. Let's hit yes and see what happens. Excellent. That's a good start, isn't it? Have I set the region incorrectly? Yes, I have. And so what's happening here is that I have not, I've set the location to US West, and the actual name of the location is West US. So that's on me. So I'm going to fix this like so. And this was not planned. I just made a mistake. And you can see I'm just looking at my pulumi.dev.yaml that it's now updated the location. So let's try it again. Yes. And that looks much better. So now we've created our resource group. We are creating our storage account. And you can see the dependencies being resolved here. Like, it knew that the resource group needed to be created first, and then the storage account needs to be created, and then the storage account static website needs to be created after that, and then it needs to create the storage blobs. So you can see it's creating these, you can see the dependencies resolving as it's creating these things in order. And that's what the benefit of using these output properties are. If we didn't use those output properties and we just assigned like strings instead, it would not do that. It would create them all at the same time, and there definitely could be errors. So I have created my straightforward, relatively simple static website, but I don't know where it is. Like, I've created this. How do I actually go and look at it and see what is actually happening and actually look at my website? Well, I can't do that from from here because I haven't actually output the actual URL. I guess if I really wanted to, I could go into the Azure console, but I don't really want to do that because I'm doing an infrastructure as code mechanism, or an infrastructure as software mechanism. So what we can do with Pulumi is we can export certain values to the console that we want to be able to use in things like shell scripts or just be able to verify things. And the way we do that is we use the export keyword in TypeScript. If you're familiar with other languages, the export mechanism is still there, but you might do it a little bit differently. So for example, in Python, it looks like this. And I'm not going to use that because we're not using Python. And in Go, it looks a little bit like this. All of these export mechanisms are there for you in your relevant languages. But in TypeScript, we're going to use the export keyword. And so I'm going to use export const URL. And then I'm going to do storage account dot primary endpoints dot primary. Oh, I have seen what I've done here. I have not used an equal sign. There we go. Primary endpoint dot web. I think it's web. Yes, web. So what this will do is it will actually export the actual web address of our storage account bucket. And so what do I need to do in order to get that to my console? I'll just run Pulumi up again. And you can see that in this output here, it's not telling us it's going to recreate anything, even though we've used imperative code. It's not actually telling us that it's going to recreate anything because we've already created those resources. So while we're using imperative code, the actual resource creation is declarative. So all it's going to do here in our Pulumi stack is it's going to output the URL that we have used to create our static website. So I'm going to hit yes to make sure that's registered in the resource engine. And then I should be able to go over here and open this. And you can see our Pulumi application has been provisioned. We have a static website. We've provisioned our infrastructure as code successfully. But there's a bit of a problem. My application expects to have a server address and a host name and a date and a URL. And it's not getting any of those things because we've just deployed it to a static website. This is not a super useful application. And it's not a super useful application because it's just index.html anyway. But the point I'm making here is that we probably need to elaborate a little bit on this Pulumi static website deployment. So I'm going to take a pause there. I'm just going to check in on the chat, see if there's any other questions that people might want to Excellent. I'm just looking at the chat here. Gerard, it's good to know that the live share is useful. I'm glad everybody's enjoying that. So what I'm just going to take a pause there, give everybody a chance to ask any questions, and then what we'll do is we're going to enhance our application to deploy it into the Azure Web App service instead. Okay, so we have completed Lab 2 in our content. We've created our static website. Let's move on to Lab 3, where we're going to deploy our static website with Docker instead of, and of course, I've not updated the link. So I was like, why am I seeing the same page here? So this link is incorrect. Do not click this link. It's pointing to Lab 2. Go into Lab 3 and look at the deploy to Azure app service. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take these same static HTML files, which are in here, and we're going to package these static HTML files up into a Docker container. The reason I'm taking you through this is to show you examples of how you might provision more elaborate infrastructure. So while the application is just very simple as a static HTML website, the actual mechanism of deploying it is going to change. We're going to use the app service plan instead. And in order to kind of keep things nice and simple, I'm actually going to use the same Pulumi program to provision this. So I'm not going to create a new Pulumi program. I'm going to do it all within the same Pulumi program. So what our Pulumi program is now going to have is 2 instances of the same application, one with a static website and one deployed with Docker. Okay. So what do we need to do in order to actually deploy to an app service plan? Well, the first thing that we need to do, as we have done already, is add a new import. So I'm going to do import all as web from at Pulumi Azure native web, like so. And this gives us access to a whole new host of different resources within the actual Azure SDK. And so this is going to give us access to all of the kind of serverless kind of like hosted web applications that Azure offers us. And again, this is all generated from the Azure Open API. If there is a particular, Azure service that you are wanting to use, we almost certainly have support for it. In fact, I will guarantee that we have support for it, because if Azure has not published that API spec, we will not be able to access it. And this has been great. Like when they announced a bunch of new things, my colleague Mikhail, who is always kind of keeping an eye on the new Azure, the new Azure services, pointed out that we had support for a brand new set of resources less than an hour after they were published to the Azure API, which I think is just incredible. Being able to kind of access these different API endpoints so quickly. Okay, so let's create an app service plan. An app service plan allows us to actually deploy web applications within Azure, and it has a couple of things, but it has a couple of requirements. But of course, our IDE is going to tell us all about this. So let's create a plan. New web dot app service plan, and we're going to call this app as well, just to keep the naming consistent. And it's going to tell us that we need a couple of options. So we need a resource group name, and it's required. So let's populate our resource group name, resource group name. And then there's a couple of other optional things that we want to actually deploy as well. So I know that this is going to be a Linux deployment. So I'm going to specify the kind Linux. And I've specified this as a string, but I'm just kind of curious if there is if there's an enum for this, and if there isn't an enum, the reason there isn't an enum is because those aren't actually in the actual upstream API. So they may get added at some point, but it looks like that we can only specify a string here. And so hopefully we'll be able to kind of get those enums once the Open API spec makes them available. But for the time being, let's just specify it as a string, like so. And then we want to use a reserved type. And then finally, let's specify a SKU. So let's specify a name, B1, and a tier basic. So this is a little different. So you can see that I'm specifying these as strings rather than enums. And I think I've already kind of covered this, but just to reiterate, once these become available in the Open API spec as like defined values that are allowed, Pulumi will automatically get support for them. So across the Azure API service, there are enums for quite a lot of things, but some of the resources currently don't have allowed specified enums. So we sometimes have to specify a string in these particular cases. But you'll see, like, let me show an example here. Let's say I made a typo in basic in this string. If I ran a Pulumi up now, it would tell me eventually when I made the API call that that was not a valid value. And that could be a little frustrating for the feedback loop. However, if I typo this, I immediately get that feedback from the API. This is the power of these enums. It's telling me that the properties that exist like these are the allowed properties that exist. So you can see the benefits of where these enums are available for the different Azure SDK services, how powerful they can be, and how they can really help your feedback kind of loop. Okay, so we've added an app service plan. Now what we need to do is we need to create a place to store the Docker image that we're going to create. And so what we do here is we create a container registry within Azure. And so this is where we're going to get we're going to get into the Pulumi resource model during this process. But before we do that, let's do an import again. Import all as container registry from @Pulumi Azure native container registry, like so. You can see there that I'm getting the autocomplete for these different resource imports as well. And very similar to what we've done so far. So let's create a variable equals new container registry dot registry. And I'm going to call this app as well, just for the sake of ease. And then it's got some required arguments. So registry args, resource group name, and SKU. So there's a theme recurring here. Resource group dot name and SKU, which is a map. And we're going to use the basic SKU. So. And then finally, I just want to make sure that we have an admin user just for today. I don't want to deal with service principals and permissions while I'm showing you how this kind of stuff works. So I'm just going to enable the admin user and so that we have full access to this registry. Okay, so what we now need to do is we need to grab an output value from this registry and we need to pass it to another resource. But we need to make sure that we pass those values not as an input property, so a Pulumi input type. We actually need to pass it as a standard TypeScript string. And to talk a little bit more about outputs and strings in Pulumi, this value here is a string, as you can see by the ID output, but it's wrapped in a Pulumi.output. And the reason for that is because this value, this resource group name, isn't actually known until the resource group has been created and we get a response from the Azure API. So in order for Pulumi to know that this value is asynchronous or it's eventually resolved, we have this Pulumi type called an output, and that eventually gets resolved. So if you need to access the raw type, so like the actual string value within the actual Pulumi resource model, we have a mechanism to do that, which essentially tells you, wait until this value is populated, and then resolve this string. And what we do here is we use an apply to do this. This is a mechanism within Pulumi that basically is an part of the asynchronous model of kind of resolving these properties. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually grab these values and assign them to standard string values. So let's go through this. And I've never done this in a live stream before. This is going to be the first time that I've ever done this. So please feel free to jump in with questions. I don't have the chat open at the moment. If you do have any questions, then please just drop them in the chat and Zach will interrupt me and we could talk a little bit more about this. It's really important to understand this particular piece of the Pulumi resource model. This is the most common question that we get in our Pulumi community. And once it makes sense to people, they start to really kind of see the power of it, but it does kind of take a little bit of wrapping your head around. So let's specify a value called credentials. And what we're going to do is we're going to need to grab two different values from this registry. We need to grab the resource group name and the registry name, and then we need to populate our credentials from those resolved values. Pulumi.all allows you to do multiple applies. So it allows you to chain them in a specific way. So I'm going to do Pulumi.all. Pulumi.all takes an array. So I'm going to do resource group name and registry.name. These are the two values that I actually need to grab. It needs to actually use the right constant there, Lee. And then from here, I can now do an apply. And you can see it transforms the data of the output into an actual string. So let's do apply. And then we need to actually do resource group name and registry name, like so. And this is actually an array, so let's make this an array. And then now we're in the point where we can actually apply. Now we're actually at the point here where we can actually grab these raw values, because again, what this Pulumi all and this Pulumi all is collecting two different resource outputs, and then this apply is telling us that we can access these raw values once those values have been resolved. Once they've actually turned up in the Pulumi resource model, now we can access them and kind of grab the value of these different strings. So what I want to do is I want to list the registry credentials from our created container registry. So let's do list registry credentials, like so. And I can say my resource group name is resource group name. And my registry name is my registry name. Again, this list registry credentials here takes two strings, two standard resolve strings, not a Pulumi output string, but two standard strings to actually look up the registry credentials for our container registry. But in order to make sure we have these values in a plain string, we need to wait until the registry has been created in order to retrieve them. And this is what this all and this apply is doing. It's telling us not to look up the list registry credentials until the registry has been created and these values are actually known. So now that I've listed the registry credentials, I can now apply them to, I can now assign them to variables. So let's do admin username, const admin password equals credentials dot apply. And again, I need to use an apply here because I need to wait for this value to finish and to return. I need to say to this constant, don't try and populate this constant until this credentials operation is finished. So I'm going to use credentials is credentials dot username. So, and then the admin password is credentials dot apply credentials eventually credentials dot password. And I believe the password is, yeah, so this returns an array. So what I need to do is grab the value like so. And so this is a relatively intermediate, I would say, part of the Pulumi model. And you will run into this as you are creating infrastructure with Pulumi. You will run into these kind of apply mechanisms. And I'll be completely honest here. I do not come from a software engineering background. I come from an infrastructure background. And I have not written a whole bunch of JavaScript before in my life. And so this took a little while for me to kind of understand what was happening here. But once you actually kind of get the idea that all these apply mechanisms are doing is saying to the Pulumi resource model, I know that this value is going to be populated eventually. Please don't do anything until that value has returned. Once you kind of understand that, this becomes extremely powerful. This apply mechanism is really, really strong. So if you have something in the Azure native provider that has dependencies between two different things, but there is no kind of input properties for a particular resource, you can actually use these apply mechanisms to actually do a kind of chaining of creation of resources in a really powerful way. I'm going to pause there. I'm going to just check in on the chat, see if there's any questions. No questions hopefully means that everybody is kind of following along. If you are having any problems, then please do let us know. Don't be shy. I would love to make sure everybody leaves this workshop understanding how apply works, because I think it's really, really important to kind of get your head around this. And again, I really struggled with this in the first couple of weeks of using Pulumi. It's totally normal to kind of struggle with this, and we are working very hard on the product side to make this easier for everybody. Because if you're a JavaScript software engineer and you're used to kind of doing things in an asynchronous model, this probably makes a whole bunch of sense to you. Or if you've done a bunch of Python async await stuff, then that again probably makes a whole bunch of sense to you. If you use Go channels, then this again might make a bunch of sense to you. But for me personally, it took a little while to kind of get my head around it. Okay, so we grabbed our credentials. Let's just double check the chat, make sure there's no questions. Nope, that sounds good. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do here, now that we have a registry to actually upload, to actually store our Docker images in, we probably want to actually create a Docker image to push to it, which is going to be built with our Docker file here. The Docker, building a Docker image is done with the Docker provider within the Pulumi model. So what we need to do is we just need to add an additional dependency to our package.json. So in my terminal here, I'm going to run npm install @pulumi/docker. And that was lightning quick. So hopefully that's a good sign of good things to come. So I've installed the Docker provider. Now, hopefully, if you've been following along, you'll know that now means that I need to do an additional import. So import all as Docker from @Pulumi Docker. So this will allow us to actually build a Docker image locally and then push it to this registry that we've created in Azure. And so let's go ahead and do that. Let's create an image. Image equals Pulumi Docker dot container. I don't want a container. I want an image. And I'm going to call it app for the sake of ease. And then what I need to do is specify an image name. And I need to grab that image name from, I have missed my new instantiation. That's why I'm not getting my, there we go. So I need to grab this image name, and we need to do something interesting here. So we actually need to use the registry name, because if you are familiar with Docker, in order to actually push to a registry, you need to call the image the same as the actual registry name. But we also need to interpolate a string with an output. So we're getting really into the Pulumi resource model here. And so I need to join a string to a Pulumi output. Now, we know this is a relatively regular thing that happens, and so we have come up with the rather handy Pulumi interpolate function, which will allow us to do something like this. So we can grab the registry, see this registry variable here, and then I can do .login server, which is the full name of the actual registry itself, and then I can do app latest. So you can see here, I'm actually interpolating a Pulumi output and a string in the same mechanism. So this is a much simpler way of expressing some of the things that we've already done. If you just want to kind of join a string and a Pulumi output or an eventually resolved value, interpolate does come in very handy in those situations. It is telling us that we do have some missing properties, so let's finish building these out. Let's do build, and we need to specify a context. The actual context itself is www root, which is one directory above where we are. And you can see my IDE is again telling me that it is now, it's finished. I've added all the required properties, but I know that I want to push this particular image to a registry, and this is where my credentials are going to come in useful. So I'm going to specify a server, registry.login server, like so, and then I can do username, admin username, and then password and password, like so. So that is what has allowed us to, what is wrong here? Interesting. This worked earlier. So let's figure out what's going on here. So this can return undefined, and this is not allowed. So what we need to do here, okay, so let's talk a little bit through what I've done here, right? So because this apply here can actually resolve the credentials and the passwords here, but because it's possible, because this admin username here could be set to false, it's possible that these values, these admin credentials, it's possible that there could be no actual values returned. So it's possible that one of the values that might be returned, you can see here that it could return a string or an undefined value. And what is happening here is that this Docker registry input doesn't take a type of undefined. It must be a string. We're not allowed to pass an undefined value as a password. So what we can do in TypeScript is we can just do this. We can say that this value, we know this value is going to be resolved because we have set this admin user enabled. This is just, again, this is a part of the type system that allows you to make sure that the values we're passing between these different resources are going to be populated. So you see, if I remove this, you'll see that we're not allowed to pass an undefined value to our admin username. So let's tell the actual TypeScript compiler that we know that value is going to exist. I'm just going to check in on the chat, see if there's any questions. Is there too many dots on the www route? Yes, there is. Thank you very much, Gerald. Very much appreciated. Zach, please send Gerald a t-shirt if he does not already have one. Anybody who spots a typo in my code will get a t-shirt. So thank you very much, Gerald. We hope you enjoy your t-shirt. Okay, so what we've done now is we've created a Docker registry, we've created an image, and we've created an app service plan, like so. And these are the three mechanisms that we need in order to actually upload our Docker image. The final thing that we want to do is actually run our web app. So I'm just going to take a quick pause. Can you enable caching with the Docker build? I don't actually, somebody actually asked this question in the community Slack today, and I didn't get a chance to dig into the answer to that. So if you do, please ping me in the Pulumi community Slack. I did already get this question today. I didn't get a chance to look into it. I believe you can, but I don't know off the top of my head at the moment. So please let us know. Okay. So then let's round out, let's finish off our web app deployment. Let's actually deploy our application. So let's do const app equals new web dot web app. So again, let's have a look to see what our required properties are. We, as usually, we need a resource group name. So let's do resource group dot name. And then the next thing that we actually need is a server farm ID, which is an optional property, but we have already created a plan. So let's do plan dot ID. And then after that, we need to specify some site config, which is a map app settings. And hopefully you are kind of seeing here, I do have a reference here on the right-hand side just to kind of make sure I don't make any mistakes. But honestly, I put this together in like less than a day. I had no prior knowledge of what Azure, this web app function did before I put this together. But the autocomplete and the ability to actually populate these values within the IDE, this is so productive. Like I felt really, really powerful, like being able to, I felt really empowered. Sorry, not powerful. I felt really empowered being able to actually use this autocomplete to actually build these resources using this autocomplete. So what I'm going to do is specify some settings. So we need a Docker registry server URL. And let's specify a value of Pulumi, interpolate, HTTPS, registry dot login server. Again, we need this interpolate function here to have the string and the the string and the resolve value interpolated, and then we're going to specify a Docker registry server username value admin username. We've already grabbed, and then we need Docker registry server password. Value is admin password, which we've already resolved using our apply. And then finally, we need to specify a port, websites port. And this is just an Nginx configuration. So if you look at our Docker file, this is using the standard Nginx mainline Alpine Docker file. So this is going to run on port 80. And so I can just do 80, like so. Okay, so let's specify a couple of other different things. I really like this web. If you haven't used a web app, if you haven't used a web app within Azure, this is super useful. It allows you to just kind of deploy these Docker images in a really useful, a really easy mechanism. So I'm going to say that I want this to be always on. And then I'm going to do Linux FX version is Pulumi.interpolate Docker image name, like so. So again, interpolating a string, and what we're just saying here is we're going to run this image name inside our application. And then finally, because we are good web citizens, let's make sure we are HTTPS only and close out all of our configuration. Okay, so we're getting close to kind of running our web app at this point. And let's go over what we've already done here. So starting from here, Docker image, we created an app service plan with a SKU so that we can kind of actually contain this web app service. We created a Docker registry with the admin user enabled. We created we retrieved the credentials using a list registry credentials function, but we had to wait until the registry itself has been created so that those values are actually populated. And we also have to wait until the resource group has been created. While I created the resource group in a previous step, it is still good practice to make sure that we're actually resolving all of our outputs when we actually do these kind of mechanisms. So this would work. This would obviously work. And the ordering is preserved because we already created the resource group in our previous Pulumi up, but I've still added it to our actual apply to make sure that things are happening in the right order. Then we needed to actually grab our credentials from the username and password. We ran into a little bit of an issue where we needed to make sure that we told the Pulumi resources that we weren't going to return an undefined value. We just needed to make sure from a TypeScript perspective that these values weren't undefined. And then we're going to start building a Docker image where we're going to push it to our registry server. And we're going to use the credentials that we resolve from our apply to actually do that. Finally, what we're going to do is we're going to run a web app. We're going to run that within our resource group. We've used our plan ID, so this should all happen in the right order. And then we are also going to make sure it's always on, and then we're running HTTPS only. Let's do one final thing. We need to export our new URL, and I've actually made this a different step in the content, but I want to make sure that I'm not running too many Pulumi ups. So let's do app.default hostname, like so. Const, which should resolve into a HTTPS URL that we can do. Let's have a look what that looks like. Pulumi up. So it's going to create a Docker image. It's going to create our registry. And it's going to create an app service plan, and it's going to create a web app. It's got 4 to create. It also, you'll notice, has 6 unchanged. That's because we are obviously deploying our Docker container within the same Pulumi program, and those resources already exist, and it doesn't need to recreate them. So let's go ahead and run that. I'm going to open a new terminal so you can see what's happening in the background. So you can see it's creating the Docker image, it's creating the web app service plan, and it's doing these in parallel because we have no dependencies. Our app service plan and our registry have the only dependencies they have are on the resource group. They already exist. So it can create all 3 of these different things in parallel. And so they've all been created at the same time. Our image push has succeeded. You should be able to see here if I run Docker images, and I have lots of images, but you should be able to see here that here's our created web app with latest, and this is the name of our Azure registry, and it's created our web app, it's created our registry, it's pushed the image to that registry, and it's created a web app URL with 4 created, 6 unchanged. The old URL is still there. It hasn't changed, but it's created a new web app URL. So let's copy this link and make sure everything worked as we expected it to. And look at that. We have deployed our application again, but now we're getting now our application is actually populating these values. So you can see it's got a local address with it's running within the web app. It's got an actual valid server name. It's got a standard date. And if I hit auto refresh, it should keep refreshing these. And that is how you would deploy a Docker image with the web app. So that is basically all of the content that I had to put together for today. I know this webinar was scheduled for 2 hours. You never know how long these things are going to take. But that was all of the things that I kind of wanted to show you today. Let's reiterate a couple of the things that we learned about Azure specifically today. We learned that all of the actual resources that we've used within Azure are generated from the upstream API that Azure publishes. So we know that all of these different resources, and I haven't used any of these resources today simply to keep this workshop relatively light. But if you do want to use any part of the Azure provider surface area, it is available within the Azure native resource, within the Azure native Pulumi package. It is available because we generate it from the upstream API. We also learned that because we generate these values from the upstream API, that we can use these pre-populated enums that allow us to be able to actually ensure that we aren't making mistakes and we aren't getting things wrong. And that is available over large parts of the Azure API. We also learned about the Pulumi resource model. We learned about how apply and all allow you to actually do things once those values have been populated by the Azure API. This is all built into the Azure native provider and is available in all Pulumi providers. And finally, we also, earlier on in our labs, we also learned that you can use the power of the programming languages to be able to actually use all of the different mechanisms that you are used to in your application development lifecycle while you are provisioning your infrastructure in Azure. We learned that we can do things like map. We saw an example of if we were providing incorrect values between different resources. And we also learned that you can actually interpolate those values as well and actually still make sure that you're getting the right values. So I'm going to pause there. We are coming towards the end. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm just going to wait and see if there's any questions that anybody feels like they'd like to, any questions they feel like they would like to kind of ask. We do have a little bit of time if anybody feels like they kind of want to kind of ask any questions. But I'll wait a couple minutes, see if there's any questions that come in. And if not, I really do appreciate everybody joining us today. Please do let us know how you thought about this particular workshop. I'm going to send out a poll that I'm just going to type up real quick. On a scale of 1 to 5, how did you find this workshop? 1,
Hey, Lee, there is
Yes.
a question in the Q&A that we could use your support on.
Let's take a look at that. I'm going to open this up, Q&A. I agree that I don't actually know if that, again, I put this workshop together with very limited knowledge of the actual web app mechanism itself. So like one of the things that I wanted to really show off in this particular workshop was kind of how easy it is to kind of use the actual type system. This does feel a little repetitive. I completely agree with you. What I'm going to do is kind of take a look outside of the workshop to see if there are better ways of actually specifying these app settings. It looks like that it does have a type here, so some name value pair args. I don't have an answer off the top of my head right now. Please do feel free to drop into the Azure channel in the Pulumi community Slack to kind of like work through where there might be a better way of doing this. What I will say is if this was an ARM template, this would be even more repetitive, in actually having to specify these things. I guess what you probably could do is just actually create, a standard map that you can kind of like import. Again, you have all the power of the programming language at your disposal. But maybe creating for example, maybe creating a function that returns these app settings is a perfectly reasonable way to kind of do it, which would kind of reduce the amount of boilerplate and the amount of repetition there. Okay, hopefully that is. Kind of helpful. I'm going to send out a poll. I would also like to know if the people who did join the live share, if this was a good idea, if you thought it was a good mechanism to be able to kind of follow along with what I'm doing. I would like to try this out a little bit more. There is a limit of 30 people, so I wanted to make sure that we had enough people here in the attendees list to actually kind of get the benefit out of it. If you did join the live share and you thought it was great and you thought it was a good way of actually kind of like pairing together, please let us know in the chat. If you thought it was terrible, please let us know in the chat, and I'll make sure to kind of think about other ways of doing this. But the whole idea here for these kind of workshops is, Zach and I have been running these now for around about 6 months, and we are trying to iterate all the time on what we can do in order to kind of make sure you get the most value out of them. And so any feedback and any ideas is really welcome. We are considering kind of different delivery mechanisms for these as well. Like, I know that we had some issues yesterday with the software. We are looking at different delivery mechanisms like YouTube and Twitch as mechanisms for actually delivering this type of content. But your feedback is really, really important to us. So please email us, message me directly on Twitter. I am at Briggsell on Twitter. If you really I see that somebody was trying to follow along today. I really do appreciate. I did go pretty fast today because I was hoping to get through a lot of this content, and so it's totally valid that you were, kind of trying to make sure you were trying to keep up, and I will kind of take that on board as well. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. If you do have any questions, again, please feel to. Please feel to reach out to us on the Pulumi community Slack. That is slack.pulumi.com. I am very active in there. I'm always trying to hang around to ask questions. So please just reach out to us and let us know. And then also, again, I am at Briggsell at Twitter if you feel like you would like to kind of provide more feedback to us that way as well. All right. Thanks very much, everybody. It's really appreciated. I hope you have a great rest of your day.